conveyor of further representations of our promissory obligations. To claim an incurred debt to such a publisher, therefore, is no more than to falsify both the role of creditor and the oft presumed debt, as in the present terminal obfuscation of our currency. As no commensurable property of such a mere publisher is at risk, neither can any justification exist for interest, particularly as, in fact, the same purposed obfuscation of our promissory obligations itself intentionally denies interest to every true creditor. G. Inherent sole actual issuer of promissory obligations. We, of course, are the issuers of our promissory obligations. We're formally stating it here. G. Any currency in circulation so necessarily comprised of promissory obligations inherently issues only and actually by the actions of the obligor, for it is only the volition of the obligor to which every subsequent creditor may respond. No mere publisher or issuer of further evidence of our promissory obligations, therefore, can rightly or truly claim to be a creditor. H. Inherently perfected life cycle and volume of a respective circulation. Owing to no more than an obligatory schedule of payment, retiring principal at a rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, and to an obligatory eradication of interest, which eradication of interest is incumbent upon an irrefutable disqualification of purported risk to mere publishers or issuers of further evidence of our promissory obligations, who have no commensurable property at risk because they give up no lawful consideration commensurable to the principal of their falsified debts, which eradication of interest is incumbent upon a fact of purposed denial of interest to every true creditor by the same imposed obfuscation of our promissory obligations, further proving lack of dependence or need for interest on the part of every true creditor, particularly where promissory obligations are enforced, and where the integrity of the resultant currency is indeed maintained by these indispensable principles, in which eradication of interest, furthermore, is incumbent upon an established requisite to eliminate any contrary disposition of a circulation from its essential object of perfect, undeterred representation and disposability toward the remaining value of all property. A circulation of unexploited promissory obligations, therefore, is itself regulated only by the needs and determinations of a one only truly free market, in and by which an eradication of unwarranted exploitation in the form of interest, together with an obligatory schedule of payment, automatically maintain immutable integrity of the resultant currency in a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay exactly so much for the represented property. And so long as equity is treated as effective circulation, therefore, no more than an eradication of exploitation, an obligatory schedule of payment, and convertibility of equity not only avert inevitable monetary failure, but fulfill all the requisites of a one mathematically perfected economy, accomplishing all these vital purposes not only without regulation, but even virtually without cost. I. Purposed obfuscation of the promissory obligation. In no more than their purported creation of money, then, only pretending to be creditors, no more than publishing their further representation of our promissory obligations to each other, obfuscating our obligation to pay and to retire principal into falsified debts to themselves, and subjecting the falsified debts to interest only as if principal represented risked property. The purported banking systems which have been imposed upon the world, therefore, commit global crimes, comprised first of laundering all principal into their ever unwarranted possession, and comprised thereafter of subjecting an ever-escalating sum of falsified indebtedness to an ever unwarranted imposition of interest. J. Inevitably terminal consequences of this purposed obfuscation of the promissory obligation. Because this purposed obfuscation requires payment of principal and interest out of a circulation which can be comprised at most of only some remaining principal, an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation therefore exists, in which, in plausible deployment of the obfuscation, it is impossible even to continue servicing the initial falsified sums of debt of such a system, without perpetually borrowing service principal and interest back into the general circulation. With principal borrowed back into circulation, always comprising new debt equal to any former sum of debt, therefore making it mathematically implausible to pay down any prior sum of falsified debt, and with what serviced interest is necessarily borrowed back into the general circulation, therefore, perpetually increasing every prior sum of falsified debt by so much as periodic interest related to an ever greater sum of falsified debt. With this process, therefore, perpetually multiplying a sum of falsified debt in proportion to a respectively diminishing remaining capacity to service debt, and with that perpetual multiplication of falsified debt, therefore, inevitably precipitating in a terminal sum of falsified debt, in which inevitable failure, therefore, creditworthiness to borrow further is inherently and inevitably destroyed by exceeding falsified debt, and with the natural form of failure of the subject system, therefore, being inherently to deflate in an accordingly rapid fashion, which rapid fashion inheres from facts that while the resultant circulation is mal-disposed so much towards servicing a terminal sum of falsified debt, that with creditworthiness destroyed as precludes further reflation of the circulation, final capacities to attempt to service the terminal sum of debt rapidly deplete an unsustainable circulation. And with this impetus of rapid final deflation itself accounting for present attempts to artificially extend the inherently finite lifespans of every such system, with this artificial sustention no more than sustaining a brink of terminal failure all the longer, in systems which nonetheless remain terminal because every means of artificial sustention itself can only increase an already terminal sum of debt, according to the incumbent obfuscation. With these facts themselves indicating, we can only temper an inevitably terminal process, with resultant gross inevitable dispossession thus being wrought by no more than a purposed and ever unjustifiable obfuscation of the currency, with both our production and means of production therefore largely dispossessed from us, to criminal entities which produce nothing. K. Indispensable obligations to arrest and to repair the consequences of monetary and political crimes against us. I might back up for 1 second and reiterate more or less, since I've spoken about this quite extensively before, but it might escape some of the listeners, that this is of course the very principle of the models, the computer models that I provided the first Reagan administration, which in 83 and 4, by this very process of reflation, that is, borrowing principal and interest back into circulation, accumulated an escalating sum of debt which exactingly parallels the very pattern that we've suffered. And in 1983 and 4 projected that this terminal system would impose terminal failure at approximately 2010 AD. You've been able to download those models complete with full documentation since 1984 or so, when I first posted them to public bulletin boards 10 years before the formal internet. And of course, even today, you can still download the same models complete with source code as they were provided to the original Reagan administration, in case anyone ever, who hasn't in 43 years, might have wanted to invalidate the logic of the process. Of course, there's a handful of people, not even a handful of people, who've attempted to do that, such as William B. Ryan or G. Edward Griffin. Of course, I've used their very words to disprove their own attempts, which don't invalidate mathematically perfected economy, in fact merely intend or hope to invalidate this fact that interest, inherently, any rate of interest, which must be borrowed back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation, inherently and irreversibly, and therefore terminally, multiplies falsified indebtedness in proportion to a circulation until we suffer the present terminal failure. And a curious thing about these handful of people, I can count them on the fingers of one hand, that they have never attempted to invalidate the fact of that interest inherently multiplies falsified indebtedness. In all of these few attempts to do so, never once has any of these people ever even mentioned whether or not interest could possibly be justified applied to a falsified debt, to a purported banking system which never itself gives up lawful consideration, therefore has no principle at stake, no risk exists to justify interest. In fact, as we've explained many times over, in general across the world, if physical money is issued, it generally costs in the neighborhood of $2 per $100,000 of circulation to issue mere representations of our own promissory obligations, which the purported banking system merely publishes into existence at virtually, then, no cost to itself. So I'll resume. K. Indispensable obligations to arrest and to repair the consequences of monetary and political crimes against us. Because such a crime can only persist at the behest of the perpetrators, and because the only plausible vehicle for that persistence is vast political subversion, itself so potently sustained by the monumental takings of the crime itself, therefore an indispensable obligation to arrest and to repair the consequences of the monetary and political crimes against us comprises an imperative obligation to arrest terminal failure by immediate adoption of mathematically perfected economy, comprises an imperative obligation to immediately establish absolute consensual representation, because of course these crimes would never have existed if we had absolute consensual representation. In this country, the Federal Reserve System was created after the 1912 Democrat Party platform was explicitly it promised not to create a central bank. The Democrats were elected, and the very authors of the Aldrich Bill were immediately in the Wilson administration revising the Aldrich Bill into the purported Federal Reserve Act, passed in utter betrayal of the people. Absolute consensual representation could have prevented that if people were vigilant of the crimes against us. If and only if, then, we are worthy of consensual self-rule. I'll back up again here. Because such a crime can only persist at the behest of the perpetrators, and because the only plausible vehicle for that persistence is vast political subversion, itself so potently sustained by the monumental takings of the crime